Mr. President, I come to the floor today to join my colleagues to mark International Women's Day here on the Senate floor. This day, which across the globe is celebrated in many different ways, is at its core a day to reflect on the achievements of women, achievements in politics, business, society. It's a day to reflect on what women's role was in the not-so-distant past and to celebrate how far we've come. But unfortunately, Mr. President, on this International Women's Day in the year 2012, we cannot celebrate the progress we have made without also acknowledging the unsettling truth that that progress is under threat. Today, a shadow has been cast over this day of celebration by efforts to turn back the clock here in Washington, D.C. and across the country, efforts that we all must fight back against. Mr. President, here in the Senate, only a week ago, we had a debate on the ability for women across this country to access contraceptives. It's a debate that most women believed was settled half a century ago, and one we had all hoped was in the past. However, in a scene that was eerily reminiscent of a half a century ago, last week, one woman brave enough to come forward and give voice to the importance of birth control was targeted. First, her story of a friend's battle with ovarian cancer was purposely left out of a House hearing on women's health. And then, as we've all heard, she was scorned and ridiculed by a right-wing pundit. It was a galvanizing and eye-opening moment for millions of women in our country. It was a reminder that there are some who still see women as easy targets. And it awakened many women to the fact that the gains we are meant to celebrate on a day like today could easily be lost to a political strategy that preys on women. Now, Mr. President, for many of those who watched the last few weeks play out, it may have seemed just like an isolated incident. It could appear to some a sudden and swift effort by some Republicans that have thankfully been blocked for the time being, but that's not the case. The truth is that women's access to care has rarely been at greater risk. Mr. President, from the moment they came into power, the Republicans in the House of Representatives have been waging a war on women's health. If you don't believe me, just look at the very first bills they introduced when they arrived here. Now, they campaigned across the country in the last election on a platform of jobs and the economy. But the first three bills they introduced when they got here were direct attacks on women's health. The very first one, H.R. 1, would have totally eliminated Title X funding for family planning and teen pregnancy prevention, and it included an amendment that would have completely defunded Planned Parenthood and cut off support for the millions of women who count on it. Another one of their first bills would have permanently codified the Hyde Amendment and the D.C. abortion ban. And finally, they introduced a bill that would have rolled back every single one of the gains we made for women in the health care reform bill. That Republican bill would have removed the caps on your out-of-pocket expenses that literally protect women from losing their homes or their life savings if they get sick. It would have ended the ban on lifetime limits on coverage, so important to everyone. It would have allowed insurance companies to once again discriminate against women by charging them higher premiums than men, or even denying women care because of so-called pre-existing conditions that they have, like pregnancy. And it would have rolled back the guarantee that insurance companies cover contraceptives. Mr. President, Republicans have shown they will go to just about any length to limit access to women's care, even shutting down the federal government. Now, that may seem extreme to all of you, but that is exactly what happened 1 year ago when Republicans nearly shut down the federal government over a rider that was yet another attempt to go after Title X and Planned Parenthood. I remember sitting in those meetings here late at night after months of negotiations over the numbers in the budget, astonished that Republicans were willing to throw all those negotiations away over one issue, and that was their attack on women's health. And Mr. President, the attack on women's rights are not just taking place here in the nation's capital. In state after state across the country, legislators bent on putting politics between women and their health care are undoing years of important work. A recently enacted law in Texas not only strips women of their rights, but of their dignity. It's a law that Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times recently wrote about a column, and I ask unanimous consent to put it in the record today.
Without objection.
It's a law that all women across the country should be insulted by and outraged over. Today, nearly 40 years after Roe v. Wade has passed, a woman in Texas who seeks out an abortion, one of the most difficult choices a woman and her family can face, she's not met with compassion and care, but with humiliation. And that's because they have passed a law by Republicans that she is now subjected against her will to a vaginal ultrasound. Then she's instructed to listen to a fetal heartbeat, watch the ultrasound, and numerous other state-mandated hurdles. And then she has to go home and wait for 24 hours before she can access a healthcare procedure that was made a right for women 4 decades ago. Now, you would think that after 2 years spent railing against any government involvement in healthcare, Republicans wouldn't want to dictate to states, or want the state to dictate procedures that a doctor must perform on a woman, whether she wants them or not. But then you'd be confused, because clearly, when it comes to women and their healthcare choices, these Republicans are willing to do whatever it takes for them to call the shots. Not the woman, not her doctor, not her family. And Mr. President, the sad part is other states across the country are now contemplating similar laws. So, Mr. President, the threats to women's health care are very real, and they're growing. We saw it on a panel on contraceptives in the House that didn't include a woman on the panel. We saw it in a young woman being called horrible names for telling the stories of a friend in need. We see it in Republican efforts to allow an employer to dictate whether a woman has access to contraceptives. And we're seeing it in state laws across the country aimed at stripping women of their rights and more. So on this International Women's Day, we celebrate our gains with the clear understanding that they must always be defended. And we join with women everywhere to make sure that progress is not reversed. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.